In the summer of 2009, in a rural part of Torrance County, New Mexico, a family of 4 lived quietly on a remote farm that had been in their bloodline for 3 generations. Jason Miller, a 42-year-old former mechanic turned reluctant farmer, had inherited the 160-acre property from his grandfather after the old man passed away unexpectedly the previous winter. The land was harsh and unforgiving, stretching endlessly toward the horizon under the relentless New Mexico sun, but it was theirs. His wife Claire had embraced the isolation, choosing to homeschool their 2 children while maintaining a small flock of chickens behind the weathered red barn that had anchored the property since the 1940s. The Miller family had settled into the rhythm of rural life with surprising ease. Jason spent his days maintaining the aging infrastructure of the farm, fixing water pumps and mending fence lines with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to rebuilding car engines. Claire found peace in the simplicity of their new existence, teaching 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Lila their lessons at the kitchen table each morning while the desert wind whispered through the cottonwood trees their grandfather had planted decades ago. They were the kind of family that minded their own business and expected the same courtesy from others. Their nearest neighbors lived 7 miles away, and the closest town consisted of little more than a gas station, a diner, and a post office that closed at noon on Saturdays. It was exactly the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened, where the most exciting event of the year was the annual county fair that drew maybe 200 people from across the region. It started on a Tuesday night in mid-June, when the desert heat had finally begun to break and the evening air carried just the faintest promise of relief from another scorching day. Jason was closing up the barn after completing his nightly routine of checking on the chickens and securing the feed storage against the ever-present threat of coyotes and other desert predators. The work was mindless but necessary, the kind of repetitive task that allowed his mind to wander while his hands went through the familiar motions of latching doors and checking water supplies. He'd been thinking about the tractor that had been making strange noises earlier that day, mentally cataloging the steps he'd need to take to diagnose and repair whatever was causing the problem. That's when he noticed a strange bluish glow emanating from somewhere high above the barn. At first, he thought it was lightning. Dry heat and atmospheric pressure often played tricks in the desert, creating spectacular light shows that could be seen for miles across the flat landscape. But as he stood there watching, squinting up into the star-filled sky, he realized that this light was different. It didn't flicker or flash like lightning. It didn't move across the sky like an aircraft. It just hovered there, motionless and silent, casting an eerie blue radiance that seemed to make the familiar contours of his property look alien and strange. Jason rubbed his eyes, thinking that fatigue from the long day might be causing him to see things that weren't really there. But when he looked again, the light was still there, suspended impossibly in the night sky directly above the barn where his chickens roost. The sight filled him with an inexplicable sense of unease that he couldn't quite articulate, even to himself. That was night 1 of what would become the most terrifying week of the Miller family's life. Jason didn't mention the light to Claire that first night. He told himself it had probably been an aircraft of some kind, maybe a military helicopter on a training exercise or a weather balloon equipped with some kind of illumination system. The nearest military installation was over 100 miles away, but strange things sometimes wandered far from their intended flight paths. He went to bed that night trying to convince himself that there was a perfectly rational explanation for what he'd witnessed. But when the same blue glow appeared at exactly the same time and in exactly the same location the following evening, Jason knew he was dealing with something that defied easy explanation. By night 3, the lights were consistent, always appearing just after 9 p.m., always positioning themselves directly above the barn with mathematical precision. They didn't move, didn't pulse or change intensity. They simply hovered there for hours at a time, casting their otherworldly blue glow across the farmyard while the Miller family watched from behind curtained windows, afraid to venture outside but unable to look away from the spectacle unfolding above their home. Claire had noticed the lights by the second night, drawn to the kitchen window by the unusual brightness that seemed to turn their familiar surroundings into something from a science fiction movie. She'd asked Jason what he thought they were, and he'd given her the same explanations he'd been trying to convince himself with: military aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, maybe even some kind of elaborate prank being played by teenagers from town. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they sounded hollow and unconvincing. The children had been kept inside after dark, told that there might be dangerous wildlife in the area that required extra caution. Emma, always the more pragmatic of the two sisters, seemed to accept this explanation without question. But Lila, younger and more intuitive, kept staring out the windows with the kind of intense focus that made her parents increasingly uncomfortable. On night 4, Jason called his brother in Albuquerque, electrical engineer who might be able to offer some technical insight into what they were witnessing. But when he tried to describe the lights, he found himself struggling to find words that accurately conveyed the strangeness of the phenomenon. How do you explain to someone that lights were hovering motionless in the sky when you know how impossible that sounds? How do you communicate the profound sense of wrongness that seemed to emanate from the blue glow that had taken up residence above your barn? His brother listened patiently but ultimately offered nothing more helpful than suggestions about atmospheric reflection and temperature inversions, explanations that might have satisfied Jason if he hadn't been watching the lights with his own eyes night after night. On night 5, Jason made a decision that would provide the only tangible evidence of what the family experienced during that terrifying week. He retrieved his old camcorder from a closet, a device he hadn't used since Emma's 5th birthday party, and set it up on a tripod in the backyard. The camera was ancient by 2009 standards, but it still worked, and Jason figured that whatever was happening above his barn deserved to be documented. The footage he captured that night showed 3 distinct orbs of light arranged in a perfect triangular pattern, holding their position with mechanical precision for nearly 40 minutes. The quality wasn't great, the camera struggled with the low light conditions and the contrast between the bright orbs and the dark sky, but the basic details were unmistakably clear. 3 lights. Triangular formation. Absolutely motionless despite the gentle desert wind that was moving the trees and stirring up dust around the farmyard. Jason watched the footage dozens of times over the next 2 days, analyzing every frame for details that might provide some clue about the nature of what they were witnessing. The lights appeared solid, almost crystalline in their intensity, but the camera couldn't pick up any details about their structure or composition. They seemed to generate their own illumination from within, pulsing with a soft, steady rhythm that was barely perceptible but somehow deeply unsettling. On night 6, Claire noticed that the chickens had stopped laying eggs. The birds seemed agitated and frightened, huddling together in the far corner of their coop and refusing to venture outside even during daylight hours. The family's old German shepherd, Rex, had begun whining and pacing every evening around sunset, as if he could sense something approaching long before the lights actually appeared. On night 7, the youngest child, Lila, said something that chilled her parents to the bone. The family had been eating dinner in tense silence, all of them acutely aware that 9 p.m. was approaching and that soon the lights would return to their vigil above the barn. Emma was pushing food around her plate without really eating, while Lila sat perfectly still, staring out the kitchen window toward the barn with the kind of intense concentration that seemed far too mature for a 6-year-old child. "They're listening," she whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible above the quiet clink of silverware against plates. "But they're not talking to us yet." Claire's fork clattered to her plate as she turned to stare at her youngest daughter. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Lila didn't turn away from the window. Her small face was pressed against the glass, her breath fogging the surface as she continued to watch the barn with unwavering focus. "They're listening to everything we say. Everything we think. But they're not ready to talk back yet. They're still deciding." Jason felt his blood run cold. "Deciding what, honey?" For the first time since she'd spoken, Lila turned to look at her father. Her eyes held a strange, distant quality that made her look like someone much older than her years. "Whether we're worth keeping." Jason didn't sleep that night. None of them did. The family huddled together in the living room, taking turns keeping watch while the blue lights maintained their silent vigil above the barn. Claire held both girls close while Jason sat by the window with his camcorder, documenting everything but understanding nothing. Then came night 8, the night that would haunt the Miller family for the rest of their lives. The lights returned right on schedule, but this time they were different. Brighter, more intense, pulsing with an energy that seemed to make the very air around the barn shimmer and distort. Jason could feel the hair on his arms standing up, could taste something metallic in the air that reminded him of the moment just before lightning strikes. Against every instinct screaming at him to stay inside, to keep his family safe behind locked doors, Jason made a decision that would change everything. He stepped out into the open farmyard with a flashlight in one hand and his old audio recorder in the other, a device he'd used years ago to record engine sounds when diagnosing automotive problems. If something was going to happen, if these mysterious lights were finally going to reveal their purpose, he wanted to capture every detail. What happened next wasn't seen by human eyes, but it was heard, recorded for posterity by Jason's ancient audio equipment. The camcorder, still running on its tripod in the backyard, captured a sequence of low-frequency pulses that seemed to emanate from the lights themselves. The sounds were rhythmic and oddly timed, with gaps and patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Almost like Morse code, but with variations and complexities that didn't quite match any standard communication protocol that Jason recognized from his time in the Army Reserve. The sound repeated over and over again for nearly 20 minutes, a hypnotic sequence of electronic tones that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bones of anyone who heard them. When the audio was enhanced later by an amateur radio operator in Santa Fe, a friend of Jason's brother who specialized in analyzing unusual electromagnetic phenomena, the pattern translated into just 3 words that would forever change how the Miller family understood their place in the universe. "We see you." The message was repeated 17 times in the recording, each iteration identical to the last, each repetition carrying the same unmistakable implication. Whatever intelligence was behind those lights had been watching the Miller family, studying them, evaluating them according to criteria that no human mind could comprehend. After that night, the lights never returned to the skies above the Miller farm. The blue glow that had haunted their evenings for 8 consecutive nights simply vanished as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving behind only questions that would never be answered and memories that would never fade. Jason submitted the footage and audio recordings to several organizations over the following months, driven by a need to understand what had happened to his family and perhaps find others who had experienced similar phenomena. MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, accepted his materials but could offer no definitive explanation. Local news stations showed mild interest but ultimately decided the story was too speculative for broadcast. Even a UFO discussion forum online proved disappointingly unhelpful. Some users called it an elaborate hoax, while others seemed genuinely frightened by the implications of the recordings and refused to comment publicly. The Miller family found themselves isolated not just by geography but by the weight of an experience that no one else seemed capable of understanding or accepting. They'd been touched by something beyond human comprehension, marked by an intelligence that operated according to rules that defied everything they thought they knew about the world. But the Miller family never spoke of it again, at least not to outsiders. The trauma of that week in June had bonded them together in ways that were both profound and painful, creating a shared secret that would define the rest of their lives. They sold the farm within 2 years and moved to a suburban neighborhood in Arizona, but they never forgot the 8 nights when something from beyond the stars had chosen to make their remote barn the center of its attention. Their barn is still standing on the old property, now owned by a family from California who use it as a weekend retreat. The new owners have no knowledge of what transpired there in the summer of 2009, no awareness that their peaceful getaway was once the site of an encounter that challenged everything humanity believes about its place in the universe. And at exactly 9:04 p.m. every June 12th, their porch light flickers, just once, as if something out there still remembers, still watches, still sees them.